Hey everyone, let's talk about some cycles.
Like semiconductors and especially memory. This question keeps coming up, and I think we keep answering it, but something's not getting through. So I think we just need to talk about this more in depth and solidify this.
Under the Investment Analysis Tools tab, we have the Investment Thesis checklist, and we now have two checklists, one for light asset businesses and another one for heavy asset businesses.
So under that investment thesis checklist, after we map out an industry and we've targeted an individual business we want to do a deeper dive onto, we just plugged Micron into this investment thesis checklist. Obviously, it participates in a secular growth trend. But you get to this second item on the thesis checklist. What kind of business cycle is the business on? This is the debate. Is memory cyclical at all? Let's broaden that a little bit, because this has actually been here now for some time. It's not about companies being cyclical. All businesses inherently have some sort of cycle, but the cycle is short or the cycle could be long. Let's talk about that, because we're not going to just simply say cyclical anymore.
What does that even mean? Explain yourself, Nick.
We helped create this monster. The internet is awash in discussions about what's cyclical and what's not, and let's clear it up since we helped create the problem.
Okay, here's our definition of cyclical.
If you go to business school, this is the definition.
Revenue and profit moves in sync with the overall economy, over-earning during periods of economic expansion and under-earning during periods of slow or no growth in the economy. Now we're going to look at some charts that I hate. They're just lines, as far as I can tell. But this one is the World Bank global GDP percent change. Why would we use this as a metric to look at when assessing whether a business is cyclical or not?
This will help you in figuring out if the business has a short cycle or a long cycle. So a business that has a short cycle in periods where GDP is accelerating, a company with a short cycle, you're going to see an uptick in revenue. But then as that GDP growth rate slows or even decreases, it doesn't even have to be negative. If it just decreases, companies with short cycles, their revenue tends to follow these sensitive changes in the GDP very closely. So another way of saying this, a company with a short cycle, it's also just a very sensitive cyclical business. So there's one resource you can use from the World Bank. Or conversely, another one that you really, really love.
This one's even worse. It's just a blue line on white paper.
No, there's some gray bars there for when there's a recession in the U.S. economy, which is actually just propaganda, really.
So this is U.S. GDP. And just so you all know, the shaded areas are when they say there's been a recession.
Same thing, though. Company that is cyclical is going to be very sensitive to these rates of change in the GDP. Also, part of this, besides just GDP, you have to adjust for the inflation rate. And this is where maybe some of the propaganda comes in. The US never officially declared 2022 and 2023 a recession because inflation was so high that it outpaced actual spending in the economy. And so it appeared GDP continued to grow, even though real economic growth was probably actually negative for a couple of years after 2021, when the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates very aggressively.
That's not what the data says.
I know, but the real data would say otherwise. The point being, though, a company that has a short, very sensitive business cycle is going to have revenue that is very closely tied to these rates of change in GDP. Conversely, a company with a long sales cycle, maybe the revenue continues to chug along at a pretty steady pace, regardless of what the economy is doing. So let's break this down a little bit further. What sectors generally of the economy are going to be cyclical versus those that are more non-cyclical or have a very long sales cycle?
You've seen this chart now a number of times. Here are the sectors of the economy. We're going to look at this a little bit more closely and break this down, as Nick said, between the sectors that have more cycles and the sectors that either are non-cyclical or longer cycles. The reason information technology and communication services is in the middle is because it could go either way with some of the companies that fall within that sector.
Yeah, per usual, these traditional 11 sectors of the economy, we categorize things a bit differently. That's the whole point of our supply chain analysis and secular growth themes. We're still building that out slowly but surely. I'll give you a couple of examples. Within the traditional definition of the IT sector, you have semiconductors, which is really just an extension of the manufacturing industrials sector. Definitely cyclical. But also within IT, you have SaaS companies, subscription revenue. And that's a much newer industry, just a couple decades to 2.5 decades old. Those companies tend to have pretty steady revenue growth. We're going to show you some examples a little bit later. Also within communication services, within this traditional definition of communications, you might have a mobile service provider company, Verizon or Vodafone. Tends to be pretty non-cyclical. You pay your phone bill because you need to have a mobile phone these days. Maybe you try to tighten up the expense a little bit some way, somehow, if the economy is not so good, but you're probably going to continue paying for that. That would be non-cyclical. However, also within communications are internet companies that rely on advertising, like Alphabet, Google, and Meta, Facebook and Instagram. That is definitely a cyclical part of the communications industry. So it does depend on some of these, which is considered cyclical, short sales cycle versus a longer sales cycle, non-cyclical or counter-cyclical. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here.
And then an additional thing that you need to consider is the business cycle short, which lasts 1 to 3 years or thereabouts, or long, many years, or maybe even decades. And if it becomes a long enough time, we can then classify the business as non-cyclical.
This is where the debate is coming in with memory and also just data center, all things related to AI data center semiconductors and chips. The cycle is being talked about now as perhaps lasting through the end of the decade. And so everybody wants to prematurely declare that the cycle is now significantly long enough that we can declare these companies non-cyclical. But let's go back to Micron. Based on this quarterly sales chart over the last decade, is this cyclical or non-cyclical?
Short cyclical.
I think this is maybe where there's a point of confusion here. Notice the current cycle we're in for memory. We did have that downturn, that brief blip in early 2025, where we had a couple of quarters of basically stagnant or a slight dip in sales growth. It very quickly took over, and we're now in year 2 of a very strong sales cycle. But this thing could actually continue for another year or 2 and still be considered a fairly short cycle, definitely at the longer end of a short cycle. But this is not without historical precedent. Look at the one just on this chart alone from 2015 to 2018. That was about a 3 or 4 year growth run for Micron during that cycle. And it didn't change the fact that this is still ultimately a cyclical business. We'll delve into this a little bit more here at the tail end of this presentation. But there's an example of what would be called a short sales cycle and thus a pretty sensitive cyclical business.
Okay, number 2, Intuitive Surgical. If you're having a hard time seeing, the green line is total revenues and the orange bars are operating profit on all of these charts, just FYI.
Okay, Intuitive. Cyclical or non-cyclical? Also hardware. Very different type of hardware though. Very different type of finished product and service. What is it? Cyclical or non-cyclical? Kasey?
I'm going to say long cyclical.
Long cyclical? Okay, I think I would agree. An argument could be made because this is healthcare. You could argue this is also a long enough cycle that this is just non-cyclical or counter-cyclical. If you take this chart back on an annual basis and go back 20 years, there's pretty steady sales growth for a long time. Also, not such an old company either. Coming up on 30 years of existence for Intuitive. Company was pretty young for most of that time. It's only just recently become more mature. Maybe the cycle will become more apparent, but up to this point, they release a new generation of the Da Vinci machine. They get a nice run of growth from that for many years. And then just in time for that growth to start to peter out, they have a new version of the Da Vinci machine. Could be pretty long cyclical or even non-cyclical, depending on how you want to look at it.
Let's look at I would say, a truly non-cyclical business next.
Okay.
Vertex Pharmaceuticals.
It's a pretty steady looking up and to the right revenue line.
It is. The operating profit, they made an acquisition there of Alpine Immune Sciences. That's where you see that negative bar. But other than that, pharmaceutical company, generally speaking, non-cyclical.
Yeah, absolutely. Healthcare, you said that's why it was on the right-hand side of the chart earlier. Generally speaking, healthcare is considered to be a non-cyclical industry. It's going to kind of just move in a steady line up and to the right. regardless of what the economy is doing, by and large.
Next one,
This one's fun.
Adobe.
IT sector.
Software. Based on this chart, non-cyclical.
A lot of SaaS businesses are like this. This is going to be an interesting debate to see, because I think another source of contention now that we're in this bull market that is being driven by hardware and what is historically a cyclical industry versus the prior decade was asset-light software. I think a lot of people are going to argue that regardless of the cycle a business is in, they're going to fall back on the stock price and make the argument for proper portfolio diversification and cyclical versus non-cyclical solely based on stock price. And that would be incorrect. But we're going to save that topic for another time.
We're not talking about stock price in any of these charts. It's a completely different matter.
You can buy a cyclical business or a typically non-cyclical business at absolutely the wrong time and at the wrong price and valuation. So this discussion doesn't absolve you of still having to go to future steps and figure out valuation, which again, topic for another time. And also we'll come full circle on this and talk about how all this fits into portfolio allocation and how to make these decisions if you're considering adding a new stock to your portfolio. When adding something cyclical versus non-cyclical, how do you know that it actually is going to provide you that extra proper diversification versus just diversifying you?
3 more examples here. This one, energy. And if you remember, NextEra Energy would fall into the energy sector of the economy, utilities in particular, which we put in the non-cyclical segment. This is most definitely non-cyclical. In fact, it's not doing anything.
We had to switch this to annual. The quarterly numbers, which only go back a decade, not as useful.
You cooked the chart.
No, I didn't cook the chart. And actually, that's a good exercise if you go into these investment thesis checklists or just the research dashboard and compare some of these companies on a quarterly basis versus an annual basis. You can get a good feel for this as well. You can see the difference in the charts, and it'll help you understand whether something should be considered a short cycle or a long cycle. But yeah, NextEra and utilities in general, usually very, very long cycles. As you said, not much is changing whatsoever for the better part of 20 years. This is pretty stable business, non-cyclical.
Okay, next one, Credo Technologies. This one has not been a public company for that long. This is going from startup to pretty big business really, really quickly. If I had to guess, I would say it's going to be a short cyclical, but we don't really know, right?
Yeah. You can almost kind of see it though in the chart. As young as the business was over the last 5 years or so, you can see some dips in the revenue, especially there during the last actual bear market, which was also a recession in 2022 and 2023. You can see the dip there in revenue, and it took about a year plus for it to kind of get back to where it was during the pandemic era. Just a brief aside here, if you're wondering our thoughts on Credo, yeah, it was a great quarter. They just finished up their fiscal 2026. So for fiscal 2027, which we're now in the midst of, they are expecting slower growth the first 2 quarters that last through the summer of 2026. And then by the second half of the fiscal year, which will last through the end of calendar 2026 and the first quarter of calendar 2027, an acceleration in their growth rate. In total for full year fiscal 2027, 80% revenue growth and adjusted profit margins of 50%. So pretty solid report. Momentum is still definitely at work here for Credo, but we did do that write up late last year on Credo and Astera Labs as to what they need to accomplish over the course of the next 5 years, especially so that they don't fall into some of the same traps as some other semiconductor businesses during the mobile era, like Skyworks and Qorvo.
All right, last one, Palo Alto Networks.
Oh, this is a tricky one. We've got the last quarter, Q3 fiscal 2026. Cyclical or non-cyclical? What do you think, Vanna? Show us. Why don't you reveal the answer?
I'm going to say cyclical.
It sure doesn't look like it, though. Explain yourself.
We talked about this before, and it has a lot to do with the acquisitions. So I think if it wasn't for the acquisitions, it would be more cyclical than it is.
I agree. And actually, to sort of quote Palo Alto Networks CEO Nikesh Arora, cybersecurity is the most innovative, and it has to be by design, the most innovative of all industries within IT. And if you think about it, it does make sense. A new risk emerges because of some IT breakthrough, like AI right now, AI agents in particular. And if you were going to use AI agents at work, you better secure it right now or else. But then we're going to move on very quickly. Within a year or two, there's going to be some new risk that emerges and everybody is going to rush to get those secured. And then we're going to move on again. So yeah, I would agree with you. If you stripped out M&A, you would actually see a probably very, very fast cycle of growth and then revenue kind of just plateau. If a company could only do one thing and one thing only in cybersecurity, you would see almost every single one of them, with very few exceptions, just have a fast spurt of growth and then they just kind of plateau. So pretty fast sales growth cycle, and they're just constantly chasing the next big thing. One more item though, back on that last chart for Palo Alto, pointing at the last quarter that they reported on to kick off calendar year 2026, fiscal Q3 2026. The losses, just a quick note, are related to the acquisition of CyberArk and Chronosphere. Those are the logos there underneath Palo Alto Networks. But on an organic basis, Palo Alto grew 14% year over year. Bookings are up and have accelerated because of AI. And you add in the acquisitions, they had an amazing quarter. AI is very much a benefit, as we talked about 3 months ago now, when Palo Alto and the other two of the big three, CrowdStrike and Fortinet, were like half the price. Palo Alto was almost half the price it was now. We said of all the software companies out there, these guys are actually going to benefit from AI, not get hurt by it. And sure enough, here we are. It didn't even take barely 3 months for the market to decide that was the case. So congrats if you held on or added to the cybersecurity leaders. And then I guess we'll see what a smaller company like Rubrik is able to pull out of its hat here later this week.
So let's wrap this up with a couple of slides here with some additional questions for the company revenue analysis. These are all questions that we bake into our process. Who are the primary customers? Is it business to customers? Is the revenue highly concentrated? What exactly is being monetized? Is it a commodity, a product, or a service? Is it differentiated? Is it unique? And then why and how do the customers spend the money?
I love this question. This gets you deeper into the revenue. Let's say Meta or Google. How do they make money? Well, they sell ads. Okay, but that's only a partial answer, right? They have extensive behind the scenes software to monetize ads for their customers that pair those marketing customers with their users. And you get the gist here, hopefully. Answering this question superficially is probably going to do you a disservice. So dig deeper. Why would a customer specifically spend with Google or Meta versus some other advertising platform? Just as an example. It helps get you a much better understanding of what the business is actually doing. And if you think about it, everything is a transaction, as a negotiation, you're going to get a better understanding of the business. Why are certain companies able to talk customers out of their hard-earned money versus the next person in line that has something that a customer wants?
And then the final thing is risks. What are the risks for the company? Are there any notes on seasonality, customer churn, anything like that? Any change and move in their ordering? All important factors to consider if you get to this point in your process.
I think most of you are probably using AI to help you filter through those annual reports. If you're not, definitely do that. It's easier than ever to extract information from those big, scary 10Ks or whatever the filing is called for an annual report, depending on the country the company is based. Make sure you go through this exercise and use the note-taking tool we have now embedded also in that investment thesis checklist. Again, we'll go back to the example here with Micron, just an example note there that we put in on this slide on the right to help get you started in thinking about this. So as you start to fill out the checklist, take your notes. What is it exactly that Micron does to earn revenue? What is it that they compete with the other big memory companies on? SK Hynix and Samsung, especially also on NAND flash, SanDisk. What exactly is it that gets them $1 of revenue? Going through this exercise is going to help you answer really hard questions like, is memory still cyclical? And if you go through this exercise, you're going to find that when some rando accounts on social media start spewing nonsense about things are no longer cyclical, things are different now, you're going to find very few instances in your career, what should be a multi-decade career as an investor, that most things don't really change. What's actually changing is, in this case, we're talking about the cycle. It's probably a longer cycle than what we've seen in a long time, but it doesn't change the nature of the business itself. So if you go through these exercises, you're going to become a very, very powerful investor. You're going to be able to sidestep and avoid the noisy nonsense happening out there. You're going to truly understand the business and have true conviction in the business, because you're not just spouting off all the fantastic things going right and trying to pump the stock because that's what you really need to see happen. You're going to understand what's working in favor of the business. You're going to be able to ride the wave, and then you're going to know exactly what can go wrong. And depending on your style, you're going to know to strap in, or you're going to know to trim, or when to start trimming, when maybe you even want to exit the position. Everything will fall into line if you do the homework and map out companies, map out the industry, start breaking down who's who and how these companies make business, how these companies make revenue, and why people choose to do business with them. And then we're going to finish this off later on with a bit more work on quality of the business and the quantitative parts of the business that delve more into valuation. And it kind of all just falls into line. These questions that get debated on the internet these days, you don't even have to pay attention to it because you're just going to know.